Hello and welcome to the Airline Business Podcast, discussing key news and trends in the global airline sector. This time, Spirit heads into Chapter 11 as Gol eyes exit and Azul looks to have avoided it altogether. And what does Trump win mean for the airlines? My name's Graham Dunn, Executive Editor at Fly Global, and joining me as ever is Airline Business Editor Lewis Harper.
Hi Graham, how are you?
Yes, not at all bad as the onset of winter is properly kicking in as we speak. Yes, it's been an interesting few weeks as ever since we last spoke. We've had the third quarter earnings season, and I think we promised some conclusions on what we thought was going on. The last podcast will be putting you under...
didn't we? Damn it.
Kind of regret saying that now. So we'll be putting you under the spotlight, in particular in the second half. So on the second half of the pod, we're going to take a deeper dive on the third quarter results and what the mood of the industry is like. But we've had a few kind of high-profile stories happening over the past couple of weeks or so. And quite a lot of that is themed around those airlines that still needed some kind of restructuring for various reasons. And Spirit Airlines, US ultra low-cost carrier, that's a story that has been dominating our pages and probably this podcast for a year or so, with a lot of kind of, we're waiting for the next development on this. We do have another development. Things haven't necessarily worked out as people might have thought when Frontier first made a bid for Spirit. What seems years ago now.
That's it. Yeah, where do you start with Spirit? But a lot has happened, as you say, over quite a short period of time for them. You know, we talked about failed consolidation and what can then result from that. And I think we're seeing that now. You know, if the aim of stopping consolidation is to keep competition in the market for consumers, then arguably quite often the consolidation ends up happening another way. And that's not to say, you know, where Spirit is today. It's making confident noises about going into Chapter 11 and saying that the restructuring is already in place and that it expects to emerge in January 25, possibly in the first quarter. So from that point of view, Spirit's obviously, as I say, making positive noises. Equally, for a business that's already struggling, going into Chapter 11 does mean that passengers are going to lose confidence in booking with you, and there are all sorts of consequences that happen along the way. They'd already said they were selling some of their aircraft, and clearly Frontier, a possible destination from some of those aircraft, so its former suitor may end up operating quite a lot of ex-Spirit aircrafts one way or the other. We don't know. So what business emerges from this process is, you know, Spirit are obviously making confident noises, but it really will be one to watch, you know, how they actually emerge from it. But yeah, the factors involved here are multiple, whether it's, you know, the sense there are too many low-cost carriers in that market, too much capacity. There's the whole cost conversions issue that Scott Kirby of United's fond of talking about, with the cost advantage that low-cost carriers have just structurally not being there anymore. And yeah, so sort of the story coming to a head, but I think there's still a lot of unanswered questions, and it's still really one to watch, particularly given the wider context of what's going on at seemingly every low-cost carrier in the US at the moment, where they're all rethinking their products. They're all kind of struggling in the face of that big competition for United and Delta, who have kind of sorted out their product offerings in that market and are kind of making hay at the moment. So yeah, it's. I think it wasn't that long ago, was it, that it felt like the US market was a bit dulled coming out of COVID, with everyone making money and it kind of being back to the global leader of profitability. And yeah, a lot's changed, hasn't it, over quite a short period there.
Yeah, it definitely so. And there is this squeeze in that part of the market. And you're right. It is intriguing. We've obviously seen the kind of rethink of product at Southwest Airlines. There's a lot going on there as well. I suppose this is the thing for airlines, which are, when they're restructuring or when they're looking at how to position the business, is that everything is constantly moving. So even if you get the advantage of the reset, Spirit will still be coming back out into a crowded market, and a market which, you know, is under pressure. Now, you know, I think, as you've pointed out, it's definitely notable that, you know, this is a kind of, I think they agree, they term it as a pre-arranged, and it'll be a streamlined restructuring process. So, this is as good as it gets in terms of it being a relatively pain-free, hopefully. But, the world they emerge in is still going to be competitive. You've still got those same pressures that have put airlines in the US in that low-cost sector under pressure. Now, what's quite interesting is we've seen a host of airlines go through restructuring around the world. In the US, obviously, most of it, the Chapter 11 stuff was after the financial crisis. Latin America, a region where we've seen almost, a huge amount. We've seen the Aeromexico and Avianca, LATAM and Gol in Brazil go through formal Chapter 11 processes since the pandemic. And it's interesting with both Gol and Azul, another Brazilian carrier, which has been having to restructure outside of Chapter 11. But this is very much feels like the tail of the pandemic still hitting. They're still trying to restructure stuff off the back of the pandemic. Now, in these instances, you still have the same problems that are impacting all sorts of airlines, be it around currency and the sharp devaluation of the Brazilian currency. Gol's case, challenges in getting all the MAX aircraft they want, but I mean, there's no airline that hasn't been struggling getting the aircraft that they want. I think we'll talk about this probably in the second half. But there was some sort of positive news from Gol. They struck a debt for equity deal with Abro, which is the kind of holding company formed together with Avianca, and they are now talking about an exit. So that their exit, they're hoping to do around April-May time next year. So they actually returned to some growth in the third quarter for the first time in this year, which is, again, a positive step for them. So you saw Gol with signs of actually coming out of that crisis. And at the same time, you have Azul, another carrier which has been under pressure. And they have, it seems, found a way through without a formal restructuring. There's been lots of talk about would Azul have to do it. And Azul throughout have said, oh, no, we don't need to do that. We can restructure a different way. They have reached a deal with the lessors and the OEMs, and they've also secured fresh money from their bondholders. So they had an extremely positive voice to them on the third quarter call. I find they are, John Rogerson, the chief executive, is quite, he's been relatively positive about the airline throughout the challenges, even at the same point where David Neeleman is asking them to make all these additional savings and revenue gains. But, the fundamentals, the airline has always been relatively positive around. And, it does look as though if they can get their balance sheet under control, which again all sort of stems from the pandemic, that there's reasons for optimism.
Yeah, there are, as you say, slightly different reasons for this going on in Brazil. It does, Azul, as you say, every time they say they've done something to solve their issues, that it does seem to be followed up by another story not long after saying that they're considering Chapter 11. Of course, they, as it stands, as you say, they seem to be getting by without it. I mean, given, like you say, that what happened to virtually all of their peers in the region of any size, it's not a surprise those stories are swirling around after Latin carriers didn't get that government help. That if you look to the US, and I think when we move on to talk about Trump, there's one thing during the Trump era was very much that the US carriers did get a lot of help, the CARES Act during COVID. So a very different environment that when we're comparing, looking at Gol in Chapter 11, for example, compared with Spirit, which I think in the US, I think there's obviously a competitive element to this that's really driving a lot of the struggles of the low-cost carriers. But the real test is how long can Azul go? Is it really going to go and put an end to those stories about its future? Probably helps the Gol struggling in that market. It's kind of got the upper hand there a bit at the moment. And obviously the two carriers there have been working more closely together as well with a code share agreement. So who knows where it might lead in that regard. And then we're getting into consolidation again, which of course is another topic that when we come around to talk about Trump, that's an interesting one. So the Brazilian market quite fascinating at the moment, and one we'll keep a close eye on.
It definitely is. And we like other people wrote quite a lengthy piece about what a Trump or what a Harris victory in the US might mean for policies in for the US industry, but also the wider aviation industry. I mean, we've had all sorts of elections. It's been a year of elections, been unprecedented, I think is what people say, unprecedented number of elections. The US one is obviously has the widest impact, I think. And Trump winning it, it is interesting from, I suppose you've got maybe a global level you might view it at, and you've also got maybe what that means kind of domestically for US operators. It was interesting. I was at the IATA Wings of Change Europe event in Rome this week, and Willie Walsh was asked what a Trump victory meant, and he said, "Oh well, he'd been out with some various US airline leaders the previous week, and he said, well, they were net positive." I think was the description he used on it, which is, and obviously no one quite knows, until he takes office, no one quite knows what his approach will be. But, based on what they had before, exactly as you say, his support, not just wide-ranging, but very prompt with the US CARES Act to support the US airline industry or aviation industry, keep it flying during that period. That was really early. It's a really decisive step. And if you're a US carrier, you probably think, well, we are valued. He does see some benefit to it. And then the other element is around regulation. And we have seen under the Biden administration sort of probably greater reach or overreach, as has been suggested by some in terms of policy on US carriers. And again, airlines would they would rather not have that regulation. They want to be over-regulated. Willie Walsh was kind of, well, I think they are probably net positive about it. And, that evening, I think Ed Bastian was quoted as saying they were excited about the rollback of the Biden era overreach, and I think described it as a breath of fresh air. So that seems to concur with that.
Yeah, suddenly a contrast to some of the reporting of the US election results here in terms of the sentiment around what it might mean. I guess, if you're very focused with an America kind of first policy, then understandably the local airlines are positive about that. Other areas, I mean, if Trump is as good as his word and solves, and the Ukraine war stops, he solves it in one day. And I would just stress, I'm not making any judgment on Trump in terms of what my own views or anything like that. But if he does pull that off, then obviously that is a big issue for European carriers as well at the moment. I mean, naturally, I don't know whether the end of the Ukraine war, particularly if it ended on terms more favourable to Russia, would necessarily mean that overnight you would then start having European carriers overfly Russia again. But certainly any end to geopolitical uncertainty that might come from it could be again a net positive for airlines beyond the US as well. Equally, I think a concern would be around sustainability, I guess. I mean, some of that Biden overreach in double quotes might certainly refer to, well, not necessarily refer to, but certainly you need to view it within the context of what the government's doing for sustainable aviation fuel, that kind of thing. It's difficult to ignore the fact that obviously the kind of approach from Trump is not necessarily towards the net zero angle. I think there's solid evidence of that in his first time in power. So I don't know what that means for the airline industry. So on the one hand, they could celebrate if one of the biggest power in the world is saying let's not worry about net zero anymore. But I don't think that issue is going to go away, even if temporarily we have an administration there that doesn't believe it should be such a big focus. So in some ways it could be a step back for what the US has been viewed as the center of the SAF industry, really, and of the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, and everything that came from that. If that gets rolled back, then there's some interesting questions then for the airline industry about what comes next. And as I say, it's an interesting PR exercise there for airlines as well, because on the one hand, they might be pleased to lose some of that pressure, but on the other, certainly from consumers, if not in the US and elsewhere, there is significant pressure for the industry to do something about that. And not least because the science kind of says it needs to. A lot to come with Trump. Obviously, he's not even in power yet. And of course, that's without even mentioning the Middle East and what might come there, where obviously the indications are they're probably more supportive of Israel than certainly that would be their focus. And what that might mean. Again, obviously, Trump tore up the Iran nuclear agreement in his first term as well. So there's, I mean, if we wanted more to talk about, then we've certainly got it, I think, over the coming four
Yeah, and this is, you also have the potential for trade, for tariffs and what that might mean for trade and trade wars. And you can really only make conclusions about what you can, and who knows what the wider developments may or may not be. I think just sort of bringing it full circle, we started talking about Spirit Airlines and the problems that Spirit had. And, Willie Walsh again made the point that regulators have, we have seen, and certainly seen in the US, quite a negative view about consolidation within the airline industry. Obviously, JetBlue's move for Spirit was blocked. Whether it would have been blocked under a Trump administration, you could probably speculate that it may not have. Now, certainly, I think from an airline perspective, consolidation has been difficult to make happen. We've seen a lot of moves. At the event I was at, Lufthansa and ITA were the chairman was there. He's sort of desperately hoping that they might finally get it approved before the end of the year, before the European Commission changes. But that whole process has taken much longer. And I think there is definitely a conversation or a thought to be had about, is the price of consolidation too high for airlines at the moment? Because, as if we needed another reminder about how difficult the market is. Estonian carrier Nordica, after its privatization collapse, it's filed for bankruptcy just now. So there is, trying to balance consumer interests with the airline interest or the company business interest is never straightforward. But I think airlines would certainly argue that the balance hasn't quite been right. And there is definitely an argument that, does it help people for airlines having to go into Chapter 11 and having to go through restructuring processes? Certainly, the ITA chair, his view was it is better to consolidate healthy companies rather than having to go through that process. So, I think, that will be one of the changes. I would imagine JetBlue and Spirit might have wished that the election in the US had happened a little bit sooner.
Exactly, yeah. And as you say, that attitude towards consolidation could make a big difference. I mean, the other obvious points of tension that could emerge, obviously, you talked about the trade wars, that kind of thing, and any protectionist moves, particularly if they're seen as strengthening the US carriers in markets such as transatlantic and things where European carriers are already feeling a bit frustrated by costs and burdens being placed on them by the European Union, for example. You could see those tensions rising if there's a perception that US carriers are being allowed to essentially do what they want, and that European carriers are facing this kind of pressure. And again, that comes back to consolidation as well, where we know that there have been Air Europa and IEG, for example, being not happening because the remedies were viewed as too severe. But if US carriers are suddenly much more free to join forces, that kind of thing, then there's certainly potential for some new tensions to emerge, certainly in the EU as a result of that, I think. So there we are. We've ended up lobbying for very laissez-faire government policies. And
do you know, I once did a guest spot on a podcast in which I realised about 5 minutes through my answer, I was arguing the case for supporting failed, collapsed national carriers Olympic and Alitalia, that more should be done to keep them going, because I like their brands.
Yeah.
Who knows what positions we have. So we'll have a break now. After the break, we will take a look at the sentiment after the third quarter earnings results season. So welcome back. We have just had pretty much the last knockings of the airline reporting season for we'd call it the third quarter, although thanks to the beauty of the myriad of financial years that are out there, in some cases it's people's fourth quarter or second quarter or first quarter even. But we have been talking about the July to September period. And Lewis, obviously we have this aggregate of airlines. We do a benchmarking of a package of leading and a diverse mix of airlines for airline business, just try and give a sense of direction for the industry, a bit of a health check. How has that been looking?
Yeah, I would encourage anyone who hasn't had a look to have a look at flightglobal.com/airline. business. I think much more data than I can possibly talk about here. But to give a broad overview, so we're at the 9-month point of the year in calendar terms, and broadly at the moment, certainly the benchmark airlines we're tracking are kind of lagging their 2023 performance in financial, certainly profitability terms. Sorry. And I think that goes back to something I think we talked about in the previous pod. When we think about IATA's profit projection for this year, I think that kind of was based around a net profit improving. I think at this point, from certainly the airlines we look at, there's a bit of a way to go, and then the fourth quarter is going to need to go gangbusters really to turn that around. That said, the airline industry's profit, IATA are fond of pointing out that there are energy companies that make bigger profits than the entire global airline industry. and a consequence of that is that one or two airlines, Emirates, for example, announcing a pretty bumper profit can tip the whole kind of industry into improved territory year on year. So it is very tight, but certainly at the 9-month point, the industry, certainly we track about 40 airlines who report quarterly data, and that includes a lot of the vast majority of the biggest in the world, and including the US carriers that tend to drive a lot of the airline global profitability. So on operating profit terms at 9 months, the industry is about 5 billion short of where it was last year in our benchmark group. So we've got around 30 billion in operating profit so far this year. In 2023, that was about 35. In net terms, it's not a dissimilar story. We're at about 20.5 billion this year at the 9-month point, and it was 25 in 2023. The trend is interesting here, I think. Q1 globally and in most regions, the results were better year on year financially. In Q2, they were much worse year on year. And I think we talked earlier, we heard quite a lot of airlines, certainly the mid-year point, talking about how fortunes were not looking as good as they expected, certainly as the first half of the year came to an end. And there was a lot of talk about yield softness and high costs, which obviously both of which continue to be factors, but maybe certainly in the case of the former aren't quite as significant as people were thinking at the time. And that means Q3 has kind of fallen somewhere in between. The gap to 2023 profitability isn't as big, but it's still there on a global level. So the trend is towards, I guess, say Q1 better, Q2 much worse, Q3 somewhere in between. And then Q4, we wait and see. I would say, obviously, Delta, who are traditionally the first airline to report their quarterly data, did make the point they expect their Q4 to be a record. And, we talk about industry level profitability. A very strong performance from one or two of the big carriers could tip the whole industry into kind of positive territory year on year. So it's one to watch. But I'd certainly say at this point, the year after a strong start hasn't panned out as strongly as I guess some might have hoped. And I certainly always go back to the sentiment even in early June at the IATA AGM, where it was pretty upbeat still. And I think then in the weeks that followed, people started to get slightly more cautious. The industry does have, certainly in the group of airlines we track, it's got some way to go if it's going to beat its profitability in 23. And, that does reflect higher costs. Revenues are up by a few percentage points. And traffic is up as well and is exceeding pre-COVID levels quite comfortably. Even in Asia, in the third quarter, that's an interesting one. Among many trends that come out of this data, the Asia Pacific region really powered ahead of its pre-COVID capacity levels in the third quarter. Chinese carriers are driving that. They're obviously driving that naturally because they take up a huge proportion of that figure, but you really notice if you look at the graphs we produce on Airline Business website, they really accelerated their growth against 2019 levels in the third quarter. And I think we've talked before about how that's partly as they seek to capture some of the international markets that aren't currently being served by European carriers, for example, because Chinese carriers can still overfly Russia. So lots of trends, and it does leave things on a bit of a knife edge, I think, in terms of whether the industry is going to emerge in 2024 having beaten 2023. And again, there are lots of ups and downs. If you read our analysis of each region, we talk about how the performance compares against 2019. Europe, for example, the profitability is ahead in the third quarter. In the US, it's much lower. And again, that refers back to some of the points we were talking about earlier with the low-cost carrier struggles. I think there was, I've said this before, but there was definitely a point earlier this year where we felt the industry had got a bit boring again, which we felt was normality. And I have to say that we spoke a bit too soon, I think, because there's so much going on at the moment. And yeah, the US was the ultimate dull market where everyone was bouncing back from COVID and everything looked great. And so much is happening globally. And obviously with the political changes we talked about in the first half as well, I think that's only going to continue.
Absolutely. I think it is interesting. Like you say, it feels like a bit like a little roller coastery, doesn't it? That we were, so we had the big jump and the big drop, and the drop probably wasn't as large as I feared. I think there's a lot of other things coincided with that. Whether you look at someone like Lufthansa, which had some challenges, the problems with the German carrier were perhaps a bit more pronounced. The issue with the US, you had some challenges around Asia traffic not coming back, affecting particularly some of those premium European carriers. A lot of that had settled down in this last third quarter. And you sum it up rightly. I think for the most part, the narratives were pretty positive. Everyone was quite pleased with where they were. They had mostly seen, if not yields improving, the yield decline falling away, and we're definitely upbeat of that continuing for the rest of the year. But all of them were broadly, when you actually looked at the numbers, most carriers were the profit was still pretty tidy, but it was a little bit short of the previous years. And I think you see that theme. I think the narrative from there are very few airlines that were worried about that last quarter. All mostly had a positive view around it being more of the same. Those that were talking about 2025 were, again, not sounding too many alarms about it, but I think there's lots of things that could happen and could impact it. And it's really interesting. The Middle East, obviously, that's a kind of a big challenge, and that can be for lots of airlines. Actually, lots of airlines that is having a bigger effect than others. So, and Antonini Tarica, I keep talking about him. He was the ITA chair at this event in Rome. But I thought it was quite interesting. He was talking about, obviously, there was the impact on their Tel Aviv routes, but it isn't just that. I mean, he was talking about the impact that then had on transfer traffic through on feeding into their US operations. So even when it might just look like one or two routes, there is a sort of a wider knock-on impact. You can see how these various geopolitical challenges that we have still have the potential to impact in the year ahead, because that's the bit no one quite knows what's going to happen.
Yeah, and even more so as we go back to Trump coming into power and what that will mean. And yeah, you touched on a bit there, but I think and we talked about it in the last pod, but certainly there's been a real ramping up of people talking about the supply chain and aircraft delivery challenges. And when we talk about the cost challenges that are a big headwind for a lot of airlines at the moment, and probably in 2025, that remains a big issue. And I think there's a lot of frustration that they're not getting these new aircraft in. They're having to keep hold of leased aircraft for longer, which is bringing costs. It means your product's not as strong because you're bringing in random leased aircraft, or you're keeping hold of older aircraft for longer. So your fuel burn is not falling as quickly as you would like. You're not able to enter new markets. That's a big theme, and it remains the case that those cost challenges probably loom larger because of that in a lot of cases. They obviously loom large in markets like the US because of some quite eye-watering labour deals as well, which, again, when we look back at what we're talking about with Spirit and everything, are all part of that. But broadly, as I say, it is on a bit of a knife edge how the industry will look in financial terms at the end of this year. But as you say, broadly, I think the fundamentals of demand on the passenger side look pretty encouraging. And obviously, another thing worth mentioning is the uptick in air cargo recently. It's it's a relatively small proportion of global airline revenue, but it does make a difference. And there are certainly several airlines where the softness in the passenger side in the third quarter was kind of offset, if not entirely, partly by some stronger air cargo revenues, as that market. Again, we can't mention air cargo though, and its reliance on global trade without then going back to what might follow if we get a more protectionist US. And we know 2019, for example, wasn't the greatest year for cargo, partly a result of the higher tensions, shall we say, between the US and China and what that did to trade. A lot. I'll go back again. We're going to have a lot to talk about.
Definitely so. Well, we'll leave it there at this time. We will be back next month where we will be able to talk a little bit more about what might come from 2025, not least because IATA will have given their forecast for their first forecast for next year. So that might give us some more to talk about there as well. But until then, thank you, Lewis.
Cheers, Graham.
As a reminder, you can catch up with all the news and stories you mentioned in this podcast at flightglobal.com/airline-business. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please like and review us. Don't forget to subscribe to get your new episodes in your podcast feeds directly. And we'll see you again next time.